And I'm going to begin at the beginning, because we really need to start with the basic building blocks so that you have the foundation upon which to build the rest of the weekend. At the very beginning, each of us is born into this life quite vulnerable. We're born in, as little vulnerable children. And in this vulnerability and sensitivity, now we don't mean vulnerable as victim or somebody who can easily be attacked or hurt. We mean vulnerability in terms of sensitivity, reactivity. Each of us, when we're born, is quite vulnerable. We have nothing to protect us in the world. We need to develop a personality that's going to be able to protect us from harm, that's going to prevent hurt from happening, and that's going to win us love, that's going to make us feel good, that's going to make a safe place on this planet for us, and that's going to be able to make us happy and efficient also.
What would happen if somebody stayed vulnerable?
We would be too fragile. If we stayed vulnerable, we'd just be too fragile. We do perceive more than with just our usual senses, our eyes and our ears, etc. We do have perceptions that go beyond the five senses. And an infant carries these. An infant also carries something we talk about as the psychic fingerprint. And that is whatever it is that makes us unique. We emerge at birth vulnerable, but with this psychic fingerprint. There's something that makes each of us unique, each of us recognizable. It's whatever that something is that a mother recognizes in her child, that lovers often see in each other. It's the something that will thread through all the paintings of El Greco, so you know it's El Greco, and you don't have to sit down and think about it. It's the something where you hear Beethoven and you know it's Beethoven. Whatever that is that gives the signature, a kind of a psychic signature, a fingerprint, we come out with. Now, we get born with this, and we are vulnerable and we are sensitive. And as we grow up, we must form selves. Now, the selves we see as the building blocks of the psyche, as the smallest psychic units. The selves are subpersonalities that, if you want to picture it, grow up to protect us, to be between this vulnerable inner child and the rest of the world. They earn us love. They protect us from hurt and harm, and they protect us from humiliation, and they make it possible for us to get along in the world. If we never developed these selves, we would never go anywhere. We would be total victims. But how does the development of personality deals with the development of what we talk of as selves that come and surround this vulnerable child and protect it in the world.
Think for a moment of a young 3-4-month-old child lying in the crib, and the mother is standing over the child, and the child is cooing and gurgling and smiling, and the mother is very, very happy. Something in the child begins to recognize that the mother is very happy when it gurgles and coos, and very unhappy when it cries. So this part that begins to develop in the child recognizes that it feels better in the world if it pleases, essentially. It's really the birth of the self that we call the pleaser. It wants to make the mother happy, because if the mother is happy, then the child is happy. So we have the beginning of a self that protects this very, very young infant by getting the love of the mother.
This pleasing self that Hal was talking about, this pleasing self that develops early in life because it makes everyone around it happy. We call it a subpersonality or a self, but it's a being. It's very real. So if my primary self is a pleasing self, I see everybody in terms of what they need, what's going to make them happy. I react to them to make them feel better in the world. And that's who I think I am. that makes it my primary self. It's the self literally that runs my life. It's who I am in the world. It's how I live in the world. It's what I see, what I hear, what I notice about in other people.
So it becomes your identity.
Precisely. It becomes my identity.
How many of these primary selves do people have?
Probably hundreds. Then you have just an almost infinite number of ways of being in the world. They're all subpersonalities. You can behave selfishly. You can behave lovingly. You can behave with compassion. You can become a rebellious child. I mean, the number goes on and on and on and on.
So what exactly is a subpersonality?
Well, a subpersonality or a self is a discrete structure within the psyche. We don't have a unified psyche. We have discrete structures within it. And each of these selves or subpersonalities is like a separate person that lives within our psyche and that takes over and will run us for certain periods of time. It has its own perceptions, its own memories, its own physicalness in my body. My pusher is a little bit tighter in the shoulders and a little bit more focused in my eyes. It's a particular part of me that runs my life in one particular way.
Is this what's called a split personality?
Well, a split personality, this is very normal psychologically, by the way. Everybody has selves that take over and that run for certain parts of our lives. A split personality is one where one part takes over and then drops you, and then another part takes over. So, for instance, a split personality would be if I go to a party and I behave somewhat unlike myself. I'm more flirtatious, or I say things I wouldn't in an ordinary day because I'm usually more careful. If I come home from that party and I say, I just wasn't myself last night, I had a marvelous time, but I'm a little bit embarrassed now, it's not a split personality. I know some other part of me came in, took over, and was behaving in a different way that night. A split personality is, I go to the party, I behave quite wildly, outrageously, and the next morning I don't know anything about it. Somebody else wakes up. There's no body keeping track of what's happening.
So it's quite normal for people to have a number of subpersonalities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we see them come out at different times. For instance, you might be somebody who goes to work and you're very strong and you're very centered and you're very sensible and you're very impersonal at work, and you work all week and you're a tiger, and you go have dinner at your mother's house Friday night, and all of a sudden you become a sort of a little boy, or you get a little more awkward, or you don't have the right answers. A different self has come in. The person who ran the business is no longer in charge.
So let's think about some of these selves that begin to develop early in our life. Let's name some of them. What are some of the really significant ones that happen to us? Pleaser. So the pleaser develops. Why does the pleaser develop? Because the family rewards us if we're nice, if we smile, if we do what we're told, if we accommodate to the needs of the family, then we're rewarded. It's really a conditioning process. So the pleaser is a very, very big primary self that develops for most of us fairly early on. Imagine now a child at the age of 2 years, and the father is swinging the child around his head wildly because the father likes to be physical. The child may really hate physicality, but he wants the love of the father, and the father's happy when the child is happy. So the child kills his fear, he kills his dislike of this, and he yells in joy at the swinging around. And so we have the birth or the development of another self in this child that wants to make the father happy, that pleases the father.
So when you say kills, what do you mean by that?
Well, whenever we have one of these primary selves born in us and operating in us, it automatically means that on the other side there is some part of us that gets rejected, that we can't have. So if the child is afraid, but he essentially rejects his fear, then he identifies with pleasing and taking care of. Another one. Inner critic. Okay, let's think for a moment how the inner critic develops. You have a strong pleaser as a primary self. The inner critic then is born right after that pleaser. What's the job of the inner critic? To criticize you if you're not nice. Okay? So this inner critic is always criticizing us whenever we do something that goes against our rules, the rules we've learned in our family system. Is that clear? How that works? If I have a rule that I have to work very hard, then my critic is going to criticize me when I'm lazy. If I have a rule that I have to get all A's in school because my family requires that, if I get a B, God help me, because my critic is going to criticize me very badly as well as the rest of my family. My critic will also criticize me so that maybe I can do things perfectly and then I won't get criticized by my parents. So the critic often gets strong in us because we have strong outside judges, and the critic wants to beat them to the punch.
Basically, if the critic gets to you first, nobody else can get to you because he'll clean you up.
Since the inner critic is responsible for the success of the psychotherapy profession, we're very pleased to talk about it. You grow up in a family system in which parents themselves are vulnerable and they really want to do what's best for you. They want to mold you in the image of their primary selves. Whenever you don't conform to their picture, that is the primary self picture of the way you should be, there is judgment and criticism of you. Sometimes the judgment is very direct. The trouble with you is that, and sometimes it's implied, it's just a look, which can be devastating. In addition to the personal family, you have the extended family of people that also have value systems, which are just basically primary selves. And these value systems also are judging you and criticizing you for what you're doing and feeling and so forth and so on. You then have the religious structure. You have the national structure of the country that you come from. So all of those are contributing to judgment. What happens from a fairly early age is that the critic is born, interestingly enough, to protect you and to carry out the rules of the primary self. For example, you're born and you learn very early you have to please people in your family or else they're not going to be happy. And that's very clear. They can be mean or they can be not nice, but they're not happy. So the pleaser becomes your primary self. Immediately then what happens is the critic also comes into operation and criticizes you whenever you're not pleasing somebody. That way it protects you because that's what it's trying to do. Because if you don't please, you get punished. And all of these primary selves are trying very, very hard to not have you feel pain. They'll do anything to not let you feel ashamed or pained. That's their job. So the critic is like the enforcer of each of the primary selves. If you do badly in school, your parents are not happy. So you develop a pusher to do well in school. The moment the pusher is there, you have a critic that comes along and says, you have to push. And whenever you relax too much or don't push, the critic is going to be on you and make you feel very bad because you're not pushing appropriately. Anybody here have a pusher? How many pushers do we have here? Active pushers. That's all?
That's all.
Oh my God. Oh my God, maybe the ones here make up for those who don't have a pusher.
Yeah.
This is obviously not the United States, that's for sure. The United States, in an audience like this, 99.999999% of the people would have a pusher in the primary cell.
The pusher is something that's very, very popular in the States, where we're getting faster and faster and faster. We have to do more. You're not satisfied with just doing something human, but you're moving, and everything has to be on schedule and performed absolutely quickly and done. So the pusher as a primary self is one that never lets you rest. Never lets you rest. Its favorite line is something like, well, as soon as you get this done, you'll feel better. Or just do this one more thing. So you might become a pusher as a primary self.
And these will actually overpower you?
They literally overpower you. So if your primary self is a pusher, you can't relax. You'll be uncomfortable when you have nothing to do.
Could you explain the pusher a bit more?
The pusher energy is very important. We'll say a little
Very
more about
important.
it, okay? Do you want to talk about it a little bit, or you want me to?
Sure.
We both had extraordinary pushers, so we're experts on the pusher.
They don't stop. They're the selves that say life is short, and I got to get this done. I got to get this done. Just one more thing, and they have these incredible drives to achieve and not to waste a minute. They can't stand empty spaces in your appointment book. They can't stand any waste of anything.
Excuse me. Now you've said that, now ask people how many pushers they are, because I don't understand what
Okay, how many pushers do we have? Okay.
Oh, I feel
I
better.
like it.
I was worried. Thank you.
We have this thing about language. We think we speak the same language.
But wait, let's finish this first, and then we'll come.
So at any rate, they're very common in our current civilization. It's speeding up faster and faster and faster. And the pushers of the world have gotten stronger and stronger. And their idea is, if you stop for a minute, you're going to lose the game of life. And there's this whole new group of pushers that are into consciousness. There are pushers who are into transformation. There are pushers who are into enlightenment. And there's this constant, if we don't get it, and we don't get it now or soon, we're going to lose.
I had a businessman that came to me once many years ago who had a extraordinarily large business in Southern California, and he wanted to sell it and move to Aspen, which is a ski resort in Colorado. And his wife said, "Look, before you sell the business, would you see Halstone? And I'm a little worried about this." So he came to see me, and I asked him. I said, "Well, why do you want to sell?" "Well, I want leisure, I want more rest, I don't like running this big business." So I did some voice dialogue with him, and first of all I talked to his pusher that was running his business, and the pusher was just extraordinary. He worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, he never stopped. So I asked the pusher, I said, "How do you feel about his moving to Aspen?" And the pusher said, "I don't mind." I said, "You don't mind that he's giving up this huge business that you've been running for the last 7 years? You don't mind?" "Oh," he said, "not at all. When he moves to Aspen, I'll have him on the ski slope at 6 o'clock in the morning every day. And in 6 months, he'll be the best skier in Aspen." The pusher doesn't care what it pushes. It just pushes. It's one of the reasons why we men get heart attacks at young ages. It's very bad for health. One of the things that we do is pay attention to dreams, because very often our dreams give us pictures of these selves in action. We had somebody many years ago who had a repetitive dream in his life that he was driving on the freeway at very high speeds, and his car ran out of control and crashed. He had that as a repetitive dream several times a week over a 10-year period. That's the pusher, you see, in operation. And at the end of that period of time, he had a heart attack, you see. So the dream process is very important to us in the study of these selves, because they give us a way of finding out who's in charge and what's been rejected. And that's an example of the pusher that Sidra was talking about. We are all creatures of conditioning. And we are, all of us, identified with certain primary selves, and they are running our life. We would like to think that we are running our life, and that's an interesting fantasy, but it's a fantasy. And you don't begin to run your life until you recognize what are the primary selves that you're identified with, okay?
Let's sum up the points so far. A human being is born totally vulnerable. Each person has an individual psychic fingerprint. We form selves, subpersonalities, to protect our vulnerability. There are possibly hundreds of these selves within each person. These selves are the normal functions of the psyche. They are not split personalities. Our identity is formed by our primary selves.
In Western civilization, the mind is king and queen. The mind is God. We are all of us trained in the machinations of the mind. It's in our blood, in our corpuscles, in our cell structure from the time we're very young. Our whole school system is based on the mind and achievement through the mind. You are not rewarded in school for being. You are not rewarded in school for how open your heart is. You are not rewarded in school for having good relationships. You are rewarded for the efforts of your mind. So the mind is like the mother of selves in that sense. It is very powerful, very profound, and most of us are identified with it. Most of us who have gone to school and have any kind of jobs or careers are identified with it. So what happens is that even in meditation, you see, when people are meditating and they're going into what they call the awareness state, for many, many people, the awareness state is not very much of an awareness state. It's an observing mind that is watching what has happened, you see. Now, that observing mind has consequences because if you're in the mind rather than awareness, you selectively are going to eliminate from consideration ways of being that are unnatural to the mind. So the mind is cool. It is more impersonal, which means that it's more focused and more objective. It has those qualities.
So how does the mind define itself when you separate it out? What does it believe itself to be?
It usually describes itself as the way I'm talking right now.
Right, as everything.
Yeah. The mind defines itself, first of all, as an observer. That's like step number one. It observes phenomena. Number two, it reports back information to some central source. Like a computer. It's really taking in information. Okay. Number three, it evaluates information. So it observes it, it gathers it together and brings it back to a central place, it evaluates it, and then it makes recommendations based on that evaluation of all of the data it's gathered as to how the person should behave. So when a person is strongly identified with the mind, it really is determining every move that you make in life, whether it's in business, whether it's in your most intimate moments with your partner or your child. The mind can be there handling the whole situation. When it's there, the other person feels that something's missing. That's the great sadness, because they feel like they're not being fed at some very deep level. So the mind is this like a sharp sword. It's a beautiful instrument of the human psyche. And there's much to get from it, you see. But if it isn't somehow related to the other side of soul and feeling and energetic reality and intimacy, there's an emptiness to it.
And the mind, if that's your primary self, is trying to figure everything out. It has no concept that there's anything beyond its domain. It has no concept of that. So it tries to solve all the problems, and it tries to figure out what the emptiness is, and it tries to figure out what's missing. And if you tell it what's missing is feelings, it can try to think feelings, and it can try to express feelings, so that you get people who are still identified with the mind, and they learn behaviors. And you've all heard people who've been in therapy or have taken workshops and have learned to talk about their feelings, but they're not talking about it with the feelings or from an aware ego. The mind is talking about it. So they'll say something like, "That made me feel very bad, what you just did." And you could just feel there's no contact. But I learned how to make an I statement about my feelings.
Is the mind alienated entirely from feelings?
The mind is not alienated from feelings, it just has nothing to do with them. It's like, again, if we use a computer image, it's as though that's Microsoft Word. It handles word processing. It knows all about word processing. If I try to do my checkbook, it doesn't go in. There's no place to pick up the information. So from the mind, there's just no place to perceive or to receive information of that sort and to feel it in those terms.
So Sidra, could you give us a couple more examples of the primary selves?
The perfectionist is a very important primary self. Now, the perfectionist wants us to get it right. If we get it right, we're okay. And if we don't get it right, we could be shamed, we could lose out, we could be not loved. So the perfectionist is something that's trained into us very, very young. There's this sense with the perfectionist as a primary self that if you can make your playpen small enough, you can do everything right. You could keep every piece in place just so that nothing bad was ever going to happen to you. The perfectionist has that as the picture. You could become an independent person, somebody who develops independence or self-reliance as a primary self, may develop that early in life because there was nobody around to really help them. And they figured unless they figured things out and they did it for themselves, it wasn't going to work. So you find these very young children who know how to take control of things and know how to do things on their own. That would be an independent one. Another one is the controlling one. Somebody who has to be in control all the time. This is very common, actually. This control primary self is something that we don't always notice. It's almost like a self that looks out behind our eyes and checks everything over and is always searching around to be sure that we haven't missed anything, that we're on top of everything, and that we're in control of our entire situation, all of our relationships, our work, our parents, whatever.
So Hal, is this normal behavior for people to swap from one personality to another to another to another, or are we meant to be just sort of one major primary self?
Well, it's normal to move from personality to personality, but to learn over time to have some choice about it. We often use the analogy with primary selves that it's like, who's driving your car? I also had a very strong pusher as a primary self, and my mind was a very strong part of me. It's hard to imagine the mind as a primary self, but it is. Because if I'm identified with my mind, I don't have available my feelings, I don't have available my sensitivity. I mean, it really is very important. So what that means is that my mind and the pusher are literally driving my psychological car. And the other parts of me that are the opposite of those, they're in the back seat or the trunk of the car, or they're not even in the car at all. So in a way, all primary selves take turns driving our car. And what we're trying to teach people how to do is drive their own car so that the primary selves and the disowned selves on the other side are there giving feedback, but where we learn to make choices in relationship to them.
You hear a lot of discussion of the inner child. Can you explain how that fits into your work?
The inner child is really a generic term for a wide range of kinds of children and ages of children. It's really a generic term. What most of them have in common is vulnerability. I mean, they're young and they're vulnerable and they're playful and they're magical and all them good things that by the time you're in the school system a short period of time, those things are not okay anymore. And you have to perform and you have to get good grades and you're sent to some kind of school. And what happens in these settings is that vulnerability is really, really killed. I mean, very harshly killed. And then whenever vulnerability is killed, you have strong power sides that come up on the other side to handle it, to handle life. I mean, you think of somebody who's being very macho and powerful and strong, and you know, what's underneath that? Underneath that is intense vulnerability that has been long forgotten.
There are different children. There's this vulnerable one that we've been talking about that has lots of feelings, the magical one that still carries all the fairies and all the magic and can make up stories. Very frequently is a child who likes to be by himself or herself in nature and just, you know, look at the sparkles on the water or the dust motes in the air.
Sometimes when you have such a child, if you're working with it, let's say with a more rational person, and you get to that magical child and suddenly the child is telling stories, making up fairy tales, talking, making up poems out loud. I mean, the most amazing things that just are mind-boggling to the person when he comes back to the aware ego. Just amazing things come out of the magical child.
There's a frightened one that just stays frightened. And that's a different one to talk to. And the most important, I think, is this playful one. There's a very playful, spontaneous, crazy, fun-loving little kid. And there are people who say, I know all about my child. And they mean that child. And that comes in a group with others.
That's a life changer when that one comes in. When people get in touch with that, they really...
In touch with the playful child.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
they love that playful child. They really do. Another one I love to talk to is the shy child.
Yes.
Because that is, I mean, he or she,
So
they're
sweet.
so sweet. And a lot of us adults have a very shy part that we've learned is, you know, I mean, we've learned in education that it's not really nice to be that way. But there's nothing wrong with being shy, you know, that's perfectly okay. So when you connect back to that from the adult place and can bring that into your life, it's a very, very sweet energy to have available.
If we're living our life unaware that these children are within us, do they send thoughts into our consciousness which make us make certain choices in life to satisfy them, even though we're unaware of it, or are they totally buried?
Most of the time, they're totally buried. For example, let's take a mother who has 3 children, okay? Now, she will tell you that she satisfies her inner child through playing with her children. But when you talk to the inner child, you get a very different story. The inner child says, that doesn't mean anything to me when she's with the children. That doesn't mean anything. That doesn't help me. I would like her to spend some time with me because I have my own tastes. And then when you talk to the child, you find out that what it really wants is a very personal, ongoing connection to us as adults. And it likes particular things. One inner child says, I wish she would just take long baths. My inner child loves when I nap. And I have a long nap. It isn't so much a long nap, but I have a long time to wake up. Other children say, just take time, I want to walk at the beach. I love nature. Please sit and listen to music. But all of them have the same common denominator, be with me. They don't care if you have 20 children outside. It doesn't help them. So to answer your question specifically, the messages that the inner child sends through are killed before they come into consciousness by the prevailing primary self, the mother of the woman who has to take care of the children, the power of the man who has to run the business, the father who's so busy driving his children every place, so those impulses of the child, which are always trying to come through, are eliminated.
How do we learn to listen to those inner children to make sure that they are taken care of?
Do you know where you find out a lot about the child that way and what the child wants? In your daydreams.
In your fantasies?
Very often in your daydreams you find you pass by the beach on your way going someplace, and you just get this yearning to just be all alone there, and then you quickly override that. It's just an automatic override because there's so much to do. Or you have an impulse just to be alone, but you can't allow yourself to be alone because in your marriage, it's how do you explain that? And your husband will be unhappy because you want to be alone, and how did you spend your afternoon? And there are all kinds of reasons why. And then when we have children, we have those reasons. So I think one of the first things to do is to learn how to sit quietly, alone, without doing anything else, and tune in to the impulses in us that say, I want. What I would like, more than anything right now, I would like to, and just to start to hear that. You can't do that on a freeway.
That's right.
You can also just get a sense of the kinds of things that make you feel good in your tummy. A hot bath, or just being quiet, or being with somebody. Taking some time in the afternoon and going someplace with somebody, not working. There's another whole area of exploration that can lead us to what the inner child wants, and that's the non-dominant handwriting, where you just take a piece of paper, and if you're right-handed, take a pencil in your left hand, and let the child write, and the child will write. Usually what happens is your right hand wants it to rush a little bit, and so you can carry on a little bit of a dialogue between the two hands. But this non-dominant handwriting will give ideas about what the child wants, what it likes, what it doesn't like.
Let's sum up the points so far. The mind is the main primary self of modern civilization. Mind is the opposite of feeling and imagination. Each of a person's primary selves take turns at driving his or her psychological car. The inner child selves are often buried by the power selves which have arisen to protect a person's vulnerability. Inner children have the desire for the adult selves in a person to spend time with them.
Could you give us some examples of other selves that are very common in human beings?
We can start with the parent-child axis, because there are a number of different offshoots of that. For example, the parent selves would include like good mother, good father, that combination, responsible parent, negative parent, what we sometimes refer to as the Kali mother, which would be from mythology, from Eastern mythology. That's the very, very negative, killing mother. And then on the child side, we have the good child, the good son and daughter, the obedient one, and then we have the rebel, the one that goes against that. So we have a whole range of selves that move within that major system. Whoever your parents are, however negative you may feel about them, however much you may want to get rid of them, they are alive and well inside of you, and at some point you have to meet them and deal with them because you can't get rid of them. So they represent definitely selves inside of us.
So even if somebody leaves home, goes to the other side of the world and wants to alienate themselves totally from their parents, they're still carrying the baggage with them.
Their parents go to bed with them every night. When they get married, their parents, who are, 9,000 miles away, are standing next to them in the aisle. And believe me, the wife-to-be or the husband-to-be will get to know those parents very well. She won't know it's the parents, or she may well know, or he may well know it's the parents, but those parents will make very strong determinations on how their life goes.
Can we ever dissolve the power that the parents have within us, so to speak?
Absolutely, yes. You can't dissolve it by trying to get rid of them. That gives them more power. You go into rebel son or daughter, they have more and more and more and more power. You can't. The way you dissolve the power is by acknowledging them as a part of you. And as you develop an aware ego in relationship to them, their power to determine your life and fate is diminished.
We see today the arising of the feminist movement, the structuring of that into society. Is there any particular subpersonality that has to be dealt with by women?
Yes, and I call it the inner patriarch. The inner patriarch is the inner representation of the outer patriarchy. Women have done a lot, and men with him, to change the outer patriarchy. There's a lot that's available to women now that's available to my daughters that was never available to me. They're expected to go to school, they're expected to have careers, they're allowed to see themselves as the equal of men. They're given a lot of power. And in a number of areas, people are saying, why aren't they taking it? What's wrong? There's something that continues to hold women back from comfortably partnering men, not from dominating them, but from just being comfortable in terms of a give and take with men. And we see that as this inner patriarch who carries about 6,000 years of patriarchal attitudes towards women. And that's what holds women back from the inside, as opposed to whatever holds them back from the outside.
And what effect does it have on an individual woman's life to be unaware of the inner patriarch?
The effect that it has on a woman's life is that it makes her essentially a daughter to the men around her. If she's not aware that this inner patriarch has a whole series of rules about her, she becomes a daughter to the men in her life. Either she's a good daughter and she takes care of them, or she's a naughty daughter and she rebels against them and expects them to carry the ideas that her inner patriarch is carrying for her. She literally is projecting her inner patriarch on the men in her life. Now, the inner patriarch in women is basically concerned with them. The inner patriarch thinks that we can't take care of ourselves, that it's a man's world, that it's a dangerous world, and that we can't make it on our own. He wants us to have a man, preferably a man who's bigger and stronger than he is, and more sensible and can fight for us in the world. So he does everything he can to keep us disempowered, to keep our sexuality under control, to keep our emotions under control, and to keep us very subservient in relationships, to have us defer to the men in our lives and take care of them, protect them, do things that will make them feel good about themselves.
So it's possible for somebody to have an inner self that is of a different sex to the one they are physically.
Yes, we all have inner selves that are of a different sex. This one is particularly interesting because he is a man. He doesn't like women particularly. He doesn't respect them particularly. Once he's worked with, he comes round. But at first blush, he usually doesn't respect women and doesn't have any appreciation of their own powers and their own wisdom. And so the woman is walking around with somebody who doesn't like her just because she's a woman, who doesn't want her to be powerful just because she's a woman, who's terrified of her sexuality just because she's a woman, and who doesn't think she's ever going to amount to anything just because she's a woman. I'll never forget, I worked with the inner patriarch of a young woman. Now, this was a woman who was very powerful, very adequate, had run her life very, very, very well. She was in her early 40s, and she was a therapist, very attractive woman. And she had just gotten married. And I was talking to her inner patriarch. And her inner patriarch was in the process of reining her in to be sure she behaved herself now that she was a wife, and that she took care of her husband, and that she didn't pay so much attention to her own needs, and that she put his first. And this inner patriarch went on and on about how she should just quiet down and push him out front and make him the showpiece. And how she was responsible for the well-being of her husband. And my favorite line of that inner patriarch was, he said, I look around at the other women, and I look around at the men in a room, and if a man doesn't look good, I know his wife isn't taking care of him. I know what a good wife is when I see how a man is blossoming. So this patriarch had come in to run the relationship. She thought a lot of the information was coming from the outside. It was coming from the inside. And there was an older woman who was watching the session. She had been unmarried for 40 years. She had been avoiding men. She would get involved in affairs, but she wouldn't marry one. And she watched that session, and she said, it wasn't the men out there that wanted that kind of behavior. She said, I hear all those rules inside of myself. All of those rules telling me if I'm married, I have to back off. I have to take care of my husband. I can't do anything he doesn't like.
So how does this inner patriarch collect its rules and regulations? If it's a male and it's inside a young woman, where do these rules come from?
The rules of the inner patriarch come essentially from two sources. They come from our culture. They're so deep in our culture that they're almost difficult to disentangle, because the entire culture that you and I grew up in is basically a patriarchal culture with a particular view of women and what they should be like. So it's in the air that we breathe. Basically, it's transmitted mother to daughter by the way the mother teaches the daughter to act, by the way she models relating to men, by literally the lessons she gives her. I literally start off my book with one of my first memories of my mother teaching me my own inner patriarch. I was playing anagrams. I was about 9 years old, and I was having this wonderful time playing anagrams with a young man and beating him. I loved winning. And my mother called me. She said, "Psst, come here." And she called me out of the room, and she said to me, "Let him win. Boys like to win, and you're going to make him feel bad." And I went back into the other room, and I lost the game. So that's the way, that's a very obvious way, but that's the way the mothers pass on the patriarchal rules and clip their daughters' wings.
Anything can become a primary self.
The rebel
Okay.
can become a primary self.
That's a
we
big
haven't
one.
had any rebels shouted out. But you know, if your family is too demanding or too strict, sometimes you just give up. You know, the older sibling is straight and you get to be the rebel because you just can't live up to the expectations, and you don't want to.
Another one, primary self. Victim, yes, victim can definitely be a primary self, a rather painful primary self, because if you are identified with victim in the growing up process and don't get out of it, you get beaten up a lot, because there's a lot of people out there that eat up victims. Okay, so that's a very painful primary self.
There's some other interesting ones. There's the hero. People have written books about the hero child. There's one that gets invisible. In households where there's been a lot of abuse, a primary self can be one that makes you invisible so that nobody notices you. They can come into a room, see everybody else, and overlook you, because that's the way you learned how to escape abuse as a child. In the same vein, there's a chameleon who can become whatever needs to happen. So that self keeps changing. They call it a chameleon or shapeshifter. I've had them call themselves shapeshifters. And they'll match anybody on the outside. They'll become invisible in a different way because they'll blend themselves energetically with whatever the requirements are so that they won't be hurt.
There's the ability to use power in many different ways. So pure raw power, manipulation. That's a very unpopular one in New Age circles because people see that as a sort of evil, malevolent self. But the fact is, it's very important to know how to manipulate people because some people are not particularly nice and they have to be handled. So it's a very, very powerful system. And we have other ones like, for example, the visionary. It's a very interesting person to talk to because he's the one or she's the one very often that really carries the vision of a person's life. Sometimes we talk to Ulysses as in Men as a kind of metaphor for this visionary, the person who has the far vision that's out of the ordinary reality, the wise person, the wise man, the wise woman, the witch, the crone, both of whom may carry different kinds of wisdom. Some of the selves we use Greek names to describe because they have such strong mythological components, like we talk about Apollo and Dionysus as opposites. Apollo, the god of the sun, order, structure, organization in Greece, the light, and Dionysus, the dark, release, letting go, ecstasy, because he had to do with the vine drinking and that kind of release. Aphrodite, who carried in mythology love and sexuality, and who was quite nasty when she got betrayed, and she's no different in us than she was in mythology. She's a nasty god to betray.
We talk about Mars, the god of war. He's very reactive and he's very powerful. We can talk to him. Women these days are contacting the virgin goddesses. That would be Artemis and Athena. And these goddesses bring them a different kind of power. They're goddesses who aren't involved in relationship. So Artemis is the one who she's a huntress. She can focus on a goal. She could shoot the goal. She could shoot the arrow to the goal and move towards that. Athena is the goddess of wisdom. And she's also the goddess of strategy. She plans wars.
Are you saying that these Greek gods and goddesses are symbols of subpersonality structures?
Exactly, at a deeper level. So Apollo, who in mythology was the god of the sun, has to do with the mind. Dionysus, who was the god of wine, release, ecstasy, that has to do with the human capacity to let go and release. Aphrodite, who had to do with love, sensuality, represents the human feelings and emotions around sensuality and sexuality. These are what Jung talked about as the archetypes. And the selves may be personal. That is to say, they may exist at a very personal level of what happened to you and your family, or the selves may be archetypal, in which case they are very powerful and very much like the gods and goddesses of mythology.
And do each of these archetypes exist within the mind of everybody?
Yes, we are all microcosms of the macrocosm. What that means is we are all miniature copies of the world. Everything lies within us.
So is it like having a program, if you like a computer program? Does each of the archetypes have its own agendas and its history and its push to certain actions?
Yes, absolutely. But an aware ego can qualify that. We are not victims of fate. We do not have to be victims of these archetypal influences. We do have choice. And that's, of course, what psychospiritual work of all kinds is about, and that's certainly what the aware ego is about, to have choice in relationship to this amazing system of selves and archetypes that live inside of us. Why would someone develop the clown as a primary self? Well, it might be a way of avoiding pain in a family system. By being a clown, you get recognition and people laugh at what you do and you have your place in the world. So each primary self is both protecting the vulnerability, stopping the pain, avoiding the pain, and helping us to be successful in the world so we don't hurt. Sometimes the development goes completely against the personality that's primary in the family. For example, a mother is very identified with being responsible and loving. Okay? She pushes that a lot in the family. She wants her daughter to be responsible and loving. In the early years, the child may well identify with that, and she's a very responsible, loving child. And then the child hits that age of 13, 12, 14, and something happens. And suddenly, being loving and compassionate becomes a very bad thing to her. And she goes into rebel. She goes into behaving very selfishly. And she takes things from her mother. She may even steal things from her mother. She does everything that's opposite to the mother. So she is in a complete reaction against the primary self system of the mother.
What is it that causes that sudden shift in a young girl like that?
Well, very often it's the pressure that the parent puts on the child to behave according to the set of rules that the primary self has. Because each primary self has a group of rules. You see, the responsible mother has rules. It says you should be responsible for your brothers and sisters. You should be responsible for your house and keeping it clean, for keeping your room clean, for being groomed properly. Okay? Those rules may be identified with your religious background. If the religious background has a strong set of rules, you should love God. You should go to church. You should say your prayers. Every set of rules sets up for the child the possibility of rebellion. So either the child identifies with those rules or goes against the rules. The second part is that in adolescence you have a peer group that gives you a new community. And that new community says it's not cool to do what your parents want. You have to do your own thing. So the child is fighting against the rules for the first time in his life or her life, and at the same time is also joining with this new community, which is dedicated to kill parents.
To say nothing of hormones.
To say yes.
At that point, there's nothing like hormones coming in and disturbing the whole, the whole developmental cycle. But it's interesting, as Hal has been showing, you can develop primary selves or personality that match the family that you come into, or the religion, or the country, or your particular social group, or you could go the other way. You can develop a primary self that rebels against and pushes away everything that you're being taught.
So you do one or the other?
Usually you do one or the other, and we've got all kinds of selves that we can develop. Almost anything human is possible to develop as a primary self.
Another interesting thing about primary selves is that countries very often develop unique primary self systems. So, for example, if we look at, say, Holland and California, thinking of California as a sort of country unto itself, one of the primary self rules in California is to be out there, show yourself. Really, really show yourself. Don't hold back. Extroversion, all of that. Holland, hold back, don't shine. Australia has a similar primary self. Don't be a tall poppy because tall poppies get cut down. In California, it's be a tall poppy. The taller you are, the better off you are. You see. So these are primary self systems of two discrete cultures. And we know a lot of people, for example, who have had relationships, Dutch people and American people, where this becomes quite a problem in the relationship. let's say, a Dutch man who is always holding himself back and afraid to really let go and let it hang out, and the woman who's out there all the time, and they're both judging each other for being too held back or too much of the, the other way.
Let's sum up the points so far. The inner parents are another set of selves that can strongly affect a person's behavior and life. The inner patriarch lives as a male subpersonality within a woman. The Greek archetypes, such as Apollo, Dionysus, and Ulysses, are real structures in the psyche and influence a person's behavior. We each have all the selves within us. We are microcosms of the macrocosm. Different primary selves are prevalent in different countries.